4:40 a.m., March 26, 2026, Joliet, Illinois. The abandoned Calumet Circuit Works sat behind a 12-foot chain-link fence at 2900 Foundry Street, its signage faded and cracked, its loading bays dark from the street side. Anyone driving past at that hour would have seen nothing unusual. One more shuttered electronics plant in the industrial belt south of Chicago, one more empty building in a county full of them. But three things gave it away, if you knew where to look. A faint blue glow from laser etch systems bleeding through blacked-out bay windows. The continuous hum of industrial ventilation running at full capacity in a supposedly vacant structure. And a heat signature from a CBP Predator B drone orbiting at 14,000 feet that showed a production floor running at full operating temperature. Acetone bath stations active. Laser systems cycling. A packaging line moving. All of it running continuously through the night for the previous 72 hours. At 4:39 a.m., 9 Bearcat G3 armored vehicles sat idling on 4 separate approach corridors around Joliet. 2 Bell 429 helicopters held station at 800 feet over Will County, running dark, no navigation lights. 240 federal agents, FBI hostage rescue team elements, HSI Counter Proliferation Tactical Units, DCIS special agents, and CBP enforcement officers were simultaneously in position at 9 facilities across Illinois, Indiana, Texas, and California. At 4:40 a.m. exactly, a single transmission went out over a secured federal radio net. Hallmark, execute. 31 minutes later, across 4 states, 9 facilities were under federal control. 71 people were in zip cuffs, and 1.2 million suspect microcontrollers, already inside the United States defense procurement supply chain, were about to become the subject of the largest military component fraud recall in a decade. 31 minutes. That's how long it took to bring down an operation that had been running for 3 years, across 17 shell entities, and had placed counterfeit chips inside guided weapons subassemblies, naval electronics platforms, airborne radar systems, and armored vehicle fire control units across the U.S. military inventory. This is the story of Operation HALLMARK, the largest domestic military component fraud prosecution since the Cold War-era export control cases of the 1990s. It didn't start with a financial analyst, a federal tip line, or a wiretap. It started with one person, in one receiving bay, holding one chip under a UV lamp on a Tuesday afternoon. Here's how it happened. To understand why a single laser-etched date code could unravel a 3-year, $1.4 billion counterfeiting operation, you need to understand how the military supply chain authenticates the components that go into it. Every microcontroller, every integrated circuit, every passive component that enters a defense system carries a certificate of conformance, a document certifying the part meets mil-spec standards for its application. That certificate lists the part number, the date code, the lot number, and the originating foundry. For incoming inspection technicians and procurement officers at Tier 2 defense subcontractors, that certificate is the front line of quality assurance. The assumption built into decades of procurement policy is this: if the certificate says the chip is right, the chip is right. What the operation at Calumet Circuit Works understood, and systematically exploited, is that the certificate is only as trustworthy as the people checking it. And for most Tier 2 subcontractors working under production schedule pressure and thin inspection budgets, checking meant reviewing paper. It did not mean examining the chip itself. Serena Park was 26 years old. She had been working as an incoming inspection technician at a guided systems subcontractor in Rockford, Illinois for 11 months. Her job? Receive inbound component shipments, verify certificates of conformance against purchase orders, visually inspect samples, log inventory. On a normal shift, she processed between 50 and 100 line items. On September 4, 2025, a shipment arrived from a distributor registered as Sterling Meridian Components, LLC, out of a commercial address in Schaumburg, Illinois. The shipment contained 4,400 units of a 32-bit microcontroller, a component used in flight control subassemblies her employer was building under a Department of Defense subcontract. Standard protocol. Park pulled a sample of 12 units, checked the certificate, visually confirmed the packaging and markings. Everything looked fine. Then she did something that wasn't in her formal checklist. She held one of the units under a 365 nanometer UV lamp, a habit she'd picked up after a colleague who had taken an advanced counterfeit detection course the previous spring mentioned it during a conversation on the production floor. Under UV light, the top surface of the chip showed a secondary marking, a ghost image, partially visible through the black epoxy coating that had been applied over the original surface. It was a date code, the original manufacturer's date code, etched into the die before remarking, that predated the existence of the foundry, whose name appeared on the certificate of conformance by approximately 4 years. The foundry listed on the cert had not yet been incorporated at the time stamped on the ghost marking beneath. One chip, one UV lamp, one observation that took less than 4 seconds to make. Park set the unit aside, documented the observation with 3 photographs taken on her work-issued tablet, and submitted a written flag to her quality assurance supervisor at 2:17 p.m. that afternoon, citing a date code discrepancy under Incoming Inspection Procedure IQC 7.4 of her company's quality management system. Her supervisor escalated it to the company's legal and compliance team by end of business. The compliance team contacted the Defense Logistics Agency the following morning. DLA contacted the FBI Chicago field office at 10:48 a.m. on September 9, 2025. Here is what one ghost date code actually meant in terms of arithmetic. The 4,400 units in the Rockford shipment were part of a larger purchase order, 18,000 units total. Sterling Meridian's invoice showed those units originating from a Tier 1 distributor in Houston, which in turn showed receipt from a warehouse in Hayward, California. That warehouse was registered to a freight forwarding company that listed its own receipt from an overseas consolidation facility. 3 tiers, 3 separate paper trails, and none of them led anywhere real. FBI Chicago's commercial fraud unit pulled the full paper chain in 72 hours. What it found was a recycling loop. Commercial-grade microcontrollers, parts manufactured for consumer electronics, costing between 40 cents and $3 each at volume, were being purchased in bulk, acid-stripped of their original surface markings in acetone baths, sanded flat with fine-grit micro-abrasive pads, in a process known in the counterfeit components trade as blacktopping, and then laser remarked with forged MIL etch systems. The result? A part that passed visual inspection as an authenticated military-grade component, accompanied by a certificate of conformance, printed on templates that closely matched the formatting and typography of legitimate foundry documents. The price spread was the entire business model. A genuine MIL spec microcontroller from an authenticated Tier 1 source ran between $85 and $340 per unit depending on specification. The counterfeits were invoiced at between $78 and $310 per unit, just below market rate to stay competitive, while the underlying commercial-grade components cost, at the volumes being purchased, under $2 each. On 1.2 million units across 460 distinct part numbers, the eventual documented scope of the ring, the spread between fraudulent invoice value and actual cost of goods came to approximately $1.4 billion across the operation's 3-year run. I spent time going through the case file documentation on this one, and one detail kept nagging at me. The operation had been active for nearly 3 years before a single flag was raised. Not because the fraud was technically flawless, it wasn't. The ghost date code was visible to anyone with the right lamp and the habit of using it. The operation ran undetected because the incoming inspection protocols at the Tier 2 level had never been built to find it. The checking wasn't happening, and no one had designed a system to make sure it did. Special Agent Diana Reyes had been with HSI Counter Proliferation Division for 14 years. Before joining HSI, she had spent 4 years in customs enforcement at the Port of Long Beach, tracking dual-use component exports. She knew defense supply chains the way financial investigators know transaction ledgers. FBI Chicago Field Office contacted HSI's Counter Proliferation Unit in Washington on September 11, 2025. Reyes was assigned as HSI lead. She was in Chicago within 48 hours. The Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, the investigative arm of the Department of Defense Inspector General, came in on day 3, represented by Special Agent Victor Callahan, 52 years old, 23 years at DCIS, whose previous 3 cases had each involved procurement fraud in defense supply chains. CBP trade fraud operations joined on day 5, following a subpoena to Sterling Meridian's freight accounts. FBI Chicago Special Agent in Charge Marcus Thorne, 47 years old, 19 years with the Bureau, and 4 prior assignments in commercial and procurement fraud, took the coordinating lead role. At 9 a.m. on September 15, 2025, all 4 agencies were seated at a conference table at the FBI's Chicago field office on West Roosevelt Road. The first question on the table: how big was this? 48 hours later, a DSIS cross-reference of Sterling Meridian part numbers against DLA procurement records returned 44 distinct lot numbers flagged across 11 defense subcontractors in 7 states. Purchases spanning a 28-month window from May 2023 through September 2025. The ring had been scaling. In May 2023, the earliest flagged transaction, 1 suspect lot number appeared in DLA records. By October 2023, 9. By June 2024, 17 per month. By March 2025, 36. And in the final month before Serena Park held that chip under a UV lamp, DSIS confirmed 44 suspect lot numbers entering defense procurement in a single 30-day window. 44 lots in 1 month. The ring wasn't just running, it was accelerating. And that is where the first serious problem presented itself. Sterling Meridian Components was one of 17 corporate entities the task force identified in the first 60 days of the investigation. Each was registered in a different state. Each used a different freight forwarder. Each operated through a separate bank account. Each had its own customer relationships. The paper trail didn't converge into a pyramid. It spread outward from an unidentified center like a flat web. Every time analysts pulled a thread, it forked into 3 more. Agent Reyes summarized the structural problem in a case strategy memo on day 44. Subject entities are organized as a horizontal network with no visible single administrative choke point. Disruption of any node does not disable adjacent nodes. Sequential warrant execution will produce evidence only for the targeted entity and will alert remaining nodes prior to action. The task force's first instinct was to move fast, identify the primary facility, execute warrants, shut it down, and use recovered evidence to pursue the rest. But moving on Sterling Meridian alone meant the 16 other entities, and whoever controlled them, would receive the alert before federal agents reached their doors. The decision was made to hold the line, run the wiretaps, find the hub first. On day 46, a Title III authorization on Sterling Meridian's primary registered contact line went into effect. For the first 19 days, routine procurement discussions, shipping schedules, payment terms, nothing that pointed upstream. On day 51, November 4, 2025, a 47-second exchange on an encrypted call referenced a production schedule and a facility in Will County, Illinois, described as the circuit room. The voice was not in any existing federal database, but the reference was specific enough to run against a property records search. The circuit room was 2900 Foundry Street, Joliet, Illinois. Calumet Circuit Works. From that point, Operation HALLMARK had its center of gravity. But finding the hub and being ready to strike it were 2 entirely different problems. And 2 weeks before the planned execution date, an intelligence report arrived that threatened to compress everything. A confidential HSI source inside the freight forwarding sector reported that Sterling Meridian had inquired about shipping rates to move industrial equipment to a new address in Nevada, a commercial warehouse facility registered under a name not yet in the HALLMARK entity database. The implication was clear. Delacroix was preparing to move the production operation. The task force had 72 hours to decide whether to execute early on incomplete simultaneous entry planning or risk losing the production facility before the search warrant could be executed. Agent Thorne called the U.S. Attorney's Office at 6:14 p.m. on the evening of March 5th. The decision: hold the timeline, accelerate the warrant packaging, complete the 9-facility entry plan. An earlier move would leave at least 4 distribution entities outside the simultaneous window. Final execution date set: March 26, 2026. The man at the center of what investigators documented as a 3-year multi-state counterfeiting enterprise was known in the supply chain community as Martin Delacroix. On paper, Martin Delacroix was a 51-year-old components distribution consultant based in Schaumburg, Illinois. He held a master's degree in supply chain management from a Midwestern university. He had worked legitimately for 2 Tier 1 electronics distributors between 2009 and 2017, reaching the level of senior regional account manager at one of them before leaving to establish an independent consulting practice. His neighbors described him as quiet, private, and reliable. Gray Lexus ES. always paid his homeowners association fees on time, had his groceries delivered, and kept limited contact with the street. His LinkedIn profile, current through September 2025, listed 17 years of industry experience and 4 professional certifications in supply chain quality management. 11 corporate clients were named, all of them real companies. None had engaged him actively in more than 2 years. What the profile did not describe was what Delacroix had done with 17 years of legitimate industry knowledge once he left authorized distribution work. Starting in late 2022, Delacroix had used his knowledge of which defense Tier 2 subcontractors operated with light incoming inspection protocols, knowledge accumulated across years of legitimate sales work, calling on those same accounts, to build what the indictment would eventually describe as a closed-loop counterfeiting infrastructure. The infrastructure ran on 3 parallel rails. First, a sourcing network. Commercial-grade microcontrollers acquired in bulk from gray market brokers in Southeast Asia. Units pulled from consumer electronics excess inventory, end-of-life production runs, and factory second stock. Purchase prices ranged from 38 cents to $2.10 per unit at the volumes Delacroix was ordering by mid-2024. Second, the processing facility at Calumet Circuit Works, leased under a shell entity called Meridian Industrial Services LLC. Business purpose listed as light industrial assembly, prototype and rework services. 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Acetone bath stations for chemical surface stripping. 9 microabrasive blacktopping stations. 4 Trotec Speedy 400 Flex industrial laser etch systems, each rated to mark 3,000 components per hour, each loaded with forged MIL spec parameter files. A quality control station, where finished units were sampled and matched against certificate of conformance templates, generated from legitimate foundry documents that had been scanned, digitally replicated, and modified. Third, the distribution web. 17 shell companies registered across 5 states, each acting as an independent Tier 2 or Tier 3 distributor, each supplying different defense subcontractor customers, each using different freight accounts, so that no single shipping pattern would generate a CBP algorithmic flag. Here is the part of this case that doesn't sit right, even now. Delacroix never interfaced directly with the defense procurement system. He never sold to a prime contractor. He never submitted a bid to a government agency. Every entity in his network was positioned at the Tier 2 or Tier 3 level, below the horizon of direct government oversight. The parts didn't go from Delacroix to the Pentagon. They went from Delacroix to a subcontractor who delivered them to a prime, who installed them in a system acquired by the government. That distance was the legal insulation. The Tier 2 buyers, in most cases, were purchasing in good faith from what their due diligence procedures identified as legitimate distributors. What strikes me about this case is that Delacroix didn't defeat the defense supply chain with sophisticated technology. He defeated it with correctly formatted paperwork sold to buyers who had neither the budget nor the mandate to independently authenticate what they were receiving. The fraud worked not because it was invisible, under UV light it wasn't, but because the tools to make it visible were absent from standard practice at the level where it was happening. Between day 51 and day 140 of Operation HALLMARK, the task force ran a multi-pronged technical intelligence program that would ultimately produce the evidentiary foundation for a 289-page sealed indictment. At the CBP Chicago field office, a tomographic X-ray bay was configured to divert and scan inbound industrial relay shipments arriving under freight accounts associated with Delacroix network entities at O'Hare International and at 2 commercial freight stations in northern Indiana. Shipments flagged under Hallmark were diverted to the X-ray bay under sealed administrative holds, examined, resealed, and released on schedule. No alteration to delivery timing, no indication to the recipient that the containers had been opened. By day 90 of the investigation, the X-ray program had documented 34 inbound consolidation shipments containing commercial-grade components in transit to 2900 Foundry Street. Title III wiretap authorizations ran on 14 phone numbers and 6 encrypted messaging accounts across the network. Over 187 days, surveillance analysts logged 4,229 intercepted communications, voice, text, and encrypted message, of which 841 were designated as case material by the prosecution team. 47 of those 841 materials featured the same unidentified primary voice, the voice that had referenced the circuit room on November 4th. An HSI undercover officer, operating under a commercial cover identity as a secondary distributor, made 3 in-person contact attempts with a mid-level Delacroix network coordinator at an electronics trade show in Las Vegas in November 2025. On the third contact, the coordinator offered to supply MIL-spec certified components with full documentation at prices 22% below published market rates. The offer was captured on a concealed recording device, an 8-minute conversation that included 3 specific part numbers, a discussion of volume pricing, and a reference to our certification process that was consistent with on-site production rather than authorized distribution. The coordinator's voice was submitted for voice print analysis against the 47 case material intercepts featuring the primary unidentified speaker. No match, but it confirmed a second voice in the operational hierarchy, and it produced a name, mentioned once in the conversation by the coordinator in a context that identified the individual as the network's owner of record, that ran through the HALLMARK entity database and matched a director listed on 3 of the 17 shell company registrations. That name connected, through corporate registration records, to a Schaumburg, Illinois business address. And a passive aerial surveillance program had been documenting vehicle movement between that Schaumburg address and 2900 Foundry Street since day 62. The gray Lexus ES showed up in 38 of the 61 observation windows. On December 18, 2025, a voice print analysis submitted by the FBI's audio laboratory in Quantico returned a confidence level of 94.3% match between the voice on the 47 case material intercepts and a reference sample extracted from a publicly available video interview conducted at an electronics industry conference in 2019. The conference video was a panel discussion on quality control in defense component distribution. The speaker was Martin Delacroix. By day 140, Operation HALLMARK had documented 14 individuals with direct operational roles inside the Calumet facility. 43 additional individuals across the 17 distribution entities. 14 overseas sourcing contacts, none of whom were on U.S. soil, and 1 man whose voice appeared on 229 of the 841 designated case material intercepts, who drove a gray Lexus to a shuttered electronics plant 38 times in a 7-month surveillance window, and whose publicly recorded voice matched a criminal counterfeiting operation at a 94.3% confidence level. The evidence was there. The question was whether 9 facilities could be hit simultaneously, in 4 different federal judicial districts, on the same morning. That question got debated across 2 planning sessions in early March 2026. The argument for sequential entry, made by 2 of the federal prosecutors on the case, was straightforward. A Calumet Circuit Works entry alone would generate enough physical evidence to support rapid follow-on warrants for each distribution entity within hours. Hit 1. Use what you find to accelerate the rest. The argument against, made by Agents Reyes and Callahan, and supported by Thorne, the distribution nodes were small operations. Some were single-room commercial mail drop addresses with minimal physical evidence on site. If any of those nodes received a call or a message reporting federal activity at Calumet, even with a 90-minute gap, document destruction would be complete before agents arrived. A single text message was all it would take to end 4 states' simultaneous prosecution. The simultaneous entry plan was approved by the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois on March 22, 2026. Arrest warrants for 71 named individuals were signed by a federal magistrate at 11:47 p.m. on March 24. 9 SWAT teams, 4 federal judicial districts, 44 separate warrant packages, 9 coordinated court authorizations, 6 days of logistics planning, a final pre-raid briefing that ran from 8 p.m. to midnight on March 25th. Teams were designated Alpha through India, 1 per facility. Alpha drew the primary target, 2900 Foundry Street, Joliet. 34 agents, 2 Bearcat G3 vehicles, tactical air support from 1 Bell 429 helicopter holding station a mile north. At 4:38 a.m. on March 26th, Alpha's forward observer confirmed the Predator B thermal imaging showed 22 individuals inside the Calumet facility, consistent with a full 3rd shift in active production. At 4:39 a.m., the Bearcats moved to the fence line. At 4:40 a.m., HALLMARK, execute. Alpha's breaching element hit all 3 loading bay doors simultaneously. Hydraulic rams mounted to the Bearcat G3 front attachment points drove through the roll-up door mechanisms in 4 seconds. Interior entry was supported by flashbang deployment through 2 pre-cut conduit access points in the east wall. Access points identified during a physical reconnaissance conducted 6 days prior under a civilian utility inspection cover. The production floor was approximately 18,000 square feet. 19 individuals were at active workstations when breach occurred. 3 more were in a break room adjacent to the main floor. FBI, hands, now. Alpha's building element cleared the main floor in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Workstations, hands up. Zip cuffs, prone on the floor, away from the acid bath stations. 1 individual moved toward a workbench as the entry team crossed the floor. 2 agents intercepted him before he reached it. The workbench contained a laptop running an active remote wipe application. The wipe was mid-execution when the device was seized and powered off. The FBI digital forensics team would later recover approximately 78% of the drive contents. The email client and encrypted messaging logs were gone, but the production scheduling database, hosted on a separate NAS server array in the mezzanine office, was intact. The mezzanine office had a manual deadbolt. An FBI HURT 2-man element applied a hydraulic breach tool to the door frame, 11 seconds from initial contact to entry. Inside, Leon Hartley, 43 years old, Delacroix's operational site manager for the Calumet facility, seated at a desk with a cell phone in his hand. He had not completed dialing. "Put the phone on the desk, Mr. Hartley. Face away from me and put your hands behind your head." Hartley was placed under arrest at 4:47 a.m. Martin Delacroix was not at 2900 Foundry Street. At 4:40 a.m., Delacroix was at his registered residence, a 2,800 square foot colonial, in Naperville, Illinois, 22 miles west of Joliet. Bravo team, 8 federal agents in 2 vehicles, had been on static surveillance at his address since 3:55 a.m. They entered at the H-hour signal with a residential arrest warrant and a simultaneous search warrant for the premises. Delacroix answered the door himself. He was in a bathrobe. He looked at the warrant document for approximately 8 seconds. He said, "You've made a mistake. Mr. Delacroix, you are under federal arrest. Turn around, please." He was zip-cuffed at 4:42 a.m., 2 minutes from first knock to custody. Across the remaining 7 facilities, 4 distribution entity addresses in Illinois and Indiana, 2 freight consolidation operations in Houston and Hayward, and a secondary blacktopping and repackaging facility in Hammond, Indiana, Charlie through India teams executed their warrants within the 31-minute operational window. 68 additional individuals were taken into custody at their respective locations. 3 named subjects were absent from their listed addresses at H-hour. All 3 were located by 6:22 a.m. through phone location data captured under the existing Title III authorizations. Total, 71 individuals in federal custody by 5:11 a.m. March 26, 2026. What the evidence processing teams walking into 2900 Foundry Street found was not a warehouse. It was an operating factory. 4 Trotec Speedy 400 Flex laser etch systems, still running when the raid hit. 11 acetone bath stations, each loaded with between 40 and 80 gallons of solvent and components in various stages of chemical surface stripping. 9 abrasive blacktopping stations. A certificate of conformance print station with a thermal transfer printer configured with active forged template files for 14 separate foundry identities. A packaging line capable of producing finished, labeled, bagged MIL spec component deliveries ready for freight pickup. The evidence inventory team logged 1,194 component lots across 460 distinct MIL spec part numbers on the Calumet floor alone. Finished product, packaged, certificated, ready to ship, totaled 287,000 units. Work in progress across the blacktopping and etch stations totaled an additional 214,000 units. Raw commercial stock held in the rear warehouse area totaled approximately 690,000 units of inbound material in various stages of chemical stripping. 14 servers were seized from the facility. The NAS array from the mezzanine office contained 28 months of production scheduling, customer order records, certificate of conformance template files, and shipping logs. 2 FBI digital forensics agents worked the server array on-site for 6 consecutive hours before the drives were transported under chain of custody to the Chicago Field Office Laboratory. Federal forensic accountants spent 11 weeks reconstructing the full financial picture from the production database, the Calumet records, and the seized documentation from the 8 other facilities. The number they eventually produced, $1.4 billion in fraudulent components shipped across the ring's documented operational life. 3 of the individuals taken into custody at the Calumet facility were later identified as H-2B temporary visa holders. They were separated from the arrest group, interviewed through an interpreter, and processed through a humanitarian protocol. They were not charged. 2 Spanish-speaking female HSI agents conducted the initial interviews. They kept the conversation calm. They spoke slowly. They explained what was happening and what would happen next. On March 27, 2026, 22 hours after the raids, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois held a press conference at the Dirksen Federal Building in Chicago, flanked by Thorne, the HSI Deputy Special Agent in charge for Counter Proliferation, and a DCIS representative. The U.S. Attorney announced the unsealing of the 289-page indictment against 71 individuals under 18 U.S.C. Section 38, Aircraft Parts Fraud, 18 U.S.C. Section 2320, Counterfeit Goods Trafficking, 18 U.S.C. Section 1341 and 1343, Mail and Wire Fraud, and conspiracy counts under 18 U.S.C. Section 371, sentencing exposure on the lead counts, between 15 and 25 years per count. Defense appearances were filed within 24 hours of the indictment's unsealing. The legal strategy took shape quickly. Delacroix's attorneys characterized the operation as a misunderstood components regrading practice, and argued that the certificates of conformance had been prepared in good faith based on representations made by overseas material suppliers. Hartley's counsel described their client as a facilities manager, with no substantive knowledge of the nature of the components being processed at 2900 Foundry Street. The prosecution had 841 designated intercepted communications, 14 servers of production data, 28 months of operational logs, a voice print match at 94.3% confidence, an undercover recording from Las Vegas, and testimony from 3 cooperating witnesses. Here's my take. The argument that a facility running 3 shifts of acid strip, blacktopping, and laser remarking operations represents a good faith misunderstanding of supplier documentation should have been dismissed at the motion stage and never litigated through to pretrial proceedings. The existence of the Calumet production operation was, on its own, sufficient physical evidence of knowing participation. That it took the prosecution 8 months to work through the pretrial motion calendar reflects resource constraints on federal commercial fraud prosecution, not ambiguity in the evidence, and that delay extended the defense recall process by 6 additional months, during which fielded systems containing suspect components remained in service. What do you think? When counterfeit components this far into the defense supply chain are discovered, does the failure belong to the distributors who sold them, to the procurement officers who relied on their certificates, or to a supply chain architecture that built no independent verification mechanism below the prime contractor level? Let us know in the comments. The trial of Martin Delacroix and 4 co-defendants began in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois on September 8, 2026. Federal District Judge Patricia Morrow presided. The prosecution's evidence package was presented across 5 weeks of trial. 841 designated intercepted communications, including 229 in which Delacroix's voice directed production scheduling, pricing decisions, and customer targeting by subcontractor vulnerability profile. Financial records from 14 corporate entities, documenting a combined transaction volume of $1.4 billion across the ring's operating history. Production database records covering 28 months of operational logs from Calumet Circuit Works. Testimony from 3 cooperating witnesses, 2 Calumet facility workers who had accepted plea agreements at the pretrial stage, and 1 mid-level distribution entity operator who agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. And the undercover HSI recording from the electronics trade show in Las Vegas, 8 minutes and 11 seconds of audio, in which a Delacroix network coordinator offered MIL-spec certified components at below-market rates with full documentation. The defense presented 2 weeks of testimony centered on Delacroix's claim that he had believed his overseas sourcing partners were supplying legally compliant overstock from authenticated Tier 1 distributors, and that the remarking operation at Calumet was a legitimate regrading and repackaging service, intended to bring parts up to specification. He testified that he had no knowledge the remarking process involved forged mil-spec identifiers. The prosecution played intercept number 229. In it, Delacroix's voice referenced a specific customer account, named the defense system the customer was building, and discussed the pricing margin on components being supplied to that account under a specific forged foundry identifier. He knew the part numbers. He knew the end systems. He knew the certification templates. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On October 31, 2026, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 23 counts against Martin Delacroix. On December 12, 2026, Judge Morrow handed down sentencing. Martin Delacroix, 22 years in federal custody, no parole eligibility under the determinate sentencing provisions of 18 U.S.C. Section 38, with a forfeiture order of $147.3 million in documented proceeds. Leon Hartley, 14 years federal custody, forfeiture of $8.2 million. The remaining defendants in the simultaneous prosecution received sentences ranging from 18 months to 12 years, with individual forfeiture orders totaling an additional $6.4 million. The 14 servers seized from 2900 Foundry Street included an encrypted partition, a TrueCrypt volume nested inside what appeared in the directory structure to be a routine automated backup folder. The FBI's Chicago Digital Forensics Unit identified the partition on day 3 of server analysis, but could not access it. It took DSIS and FBI forensic teams 6 weeks to reconstruct a passphrase from a partial string recovered from the fragmentary data on Hartley's partially wiped laptop. Inside the encrypted partition, a secondary client ledger, not the distribution company records, not the freight accounts. A second-tier ledger, 34 entries, each representing a foreign broker or overseas procurement intermediary who had placed direct orders with Delacroix for components to be shipped outside the United States. 8 entries were flagged by DSIS as referencing end-use descriptions consistent with avionics system specifications not found in U.S. military inventory. 14 entries were flagged by HSI Counter Proliferation as consistent with dual-use component re-export patterns regulated under the Export Administration Regulations and the Arms Export Control Act. There is a line in that encrypted ledger that reads almost like a product catalog. Part numbers, quantities, delivery addresses across 6 countries, handshake codes for freight intermediaries, and against each entry, a margin figure. The ledger contained enough identifiable information to support 19 Interpol Red Notice requests. Those notices were submitted by the Department of Justice through Interpol's U.S. National Central Bureau in Washington between January and March 2027. Today, 11 of the 19 subjects named in those Interpol notices remain at large. They are not in handcuffs. Their names are inside Interpol case files in Lyon, France, cross-referenced against 4 open investigations in 3 allied nations. The DoD Defense Contract Management Agency issued technical advisories to 33 prime contractors following the HALLMARK indictment. Recall and reinspection of fielded lots across the 460 documented part numbers is projected to continue for 18 to 36 additional months. Some of those components are in fielded systems today, under clean certificates of conformance that were accepted by procurement officers who had no practical way to know they were forged. Will we see another military supply chain fraud at this scale in the next 5 years? Comment yes or no, because the conditions that made HALLMARK possible haven't changed in any material way since March 26, 2026. If you want to keep walking through federal case files like this one, the way the agents themselves walk through them, number by number and intercept by intercept, subscribe to FBI Documents, and tell us in the comments which unsolved case you want us to open next. One ghost date code on one chip, held under a UV lamp by a 26-year-old technician on a routine receiving shift, unraveled 1.2 million counterfeit components already embedded inside fielded defense systems. Every certificate of conformance in the military supply chain is a number on a document, waiting for someone with the right lamp and the habit of using it. File sealed.